Welcome back to Dornsife Dialogues. We will be talking today about nuclear energy, a discussion that is both timely and steeped in history. I grew up in the 70s and 80s with duck and cover drills at school. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power disaster was all over the news when I was 7, and the Chernobyl accident happened when I was 14. Like many people in my generation, by the time I went away to college, I was terrified of nuclear weapons and a staunch opponent of nuclear power. So I was surprised when teaching undergraduates the physics of nuclear power at Columbia in the late 2000s, that nearly all of them thought it was a great idea. And then I realized these students weren't born yet when Chernobyl happened. And to them, the Cold War was a concept from the history books. They were worried about climate change and all in on nuclear energy. Our current undergraduates lived through Fukushima, but environmental concerns loom larger than ever for them. I'd love to hear what they think. In the years since I started college, I have learned to step out of my own experience, to listen to experts and evaluate the facts. And this is precisely what our panel is here to help us do today. Our conversation will be moderated by Ivan Penn, a Los Angeles-based reporter covering alternative energy for the New York Times. Before joining the Times in 2018, he covered utility and energy issues at the Tampa Bay Times and the LA Times. I can't think of a better person to moderate this discussion. So without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Ivan, who will get us started and introduce our panelists. Thank you all for coming and enjoy the program.
It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. We have a great panel for everyone. And I'm going to introduce our two wonderful panelists. Jennifer Bernstein. She is a visiting scholar with the Spatial Sciences Institute at USC Dornsife and previously served as a lecturer from 2017 to 2022. She is also the editor-in-chief for the academic journal Case Studies in the Environment and an academic liaison for the think tank, the Breakthrough Institute. Her research interests are in American environmentalism and Western American environmental history, analyzing and addressing environmental problems and social justice issues through interdisciplinary frameworks. So we welcome Jennifer to the panel. Along with her is Dr. Najmedin Meshkati, whom I have reported for quite some time. He is a professor of engineering at USC Viterbi and professor of international relations at USC Dornsife. For the past 35 years, he has been teaching and conducting research on risk reduction and reliability enhancement of complex technological systems, including nuclear power, aviation, petrochemical, and transportation industries. He has been recognized for his interdisciplinary expertise concerning human performance and safety culture by numerous organizations, including the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, and the National Academy of Engineering. He has inspected many petrochemical and nuclear power plants around the world, including Chernobyl and Fukushima. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in to our discussion. And I'll just sort of note my first foray into covering utilities and energy was with reporting on a nuclear plant 70 miles north of Tampa Bay, the Crystal River nuclear plant. And there were controversies surrounding that, and some of it stemming from some of the history. So one of the questions I want to begin with is with you, Jennifer. What made nuclear energy such a global concern for environmentalists in the 70s and 80s? And how did their activism ultimately impact the industry and policymaking?
How long do I have? And first of all, thanks for that lovely introduction.
Take your time, but hurry up.
Okay, take my time, but hurry up. I guess if I can, I'd like to just start really briefly to summarize the environmental movement around nuclear energy, if that's okay, and then I can dig deep because I do have a lot to say over there. I also want to say, to begin with, is that I'm coming at this from the perspective of a social scientist. So, I really only have the most basic understanding of the regulatory frameworks, the economics, and the policy, but I study what people think and why they think it. So there's certain things I'm sure I won't be able to answer, and hopefully others that I will. But if I were to have to give just a really quick summary of the history of the environmental movement when it relates to nuclear, I would echo the concept that nuclear is increasingly being recognized within environmentalism as a critical component in addressing climate change and meeting our emissions target. But as you articulated through your experience, it hasn't always been that way. And one of the big issues here is that people tend to trust things that they don't understand less than they trust things that they do understand. And there's a fairly widespread sentiment of not understanding really how nuclear works. And I think that's because of a couple things. One is because it's really complicated. I don't understand it either. And then on the other hand, it's because of the failure of scientists in communicating information in a way that is accessible and relatable. And the actual entire field of science communication, which is highly influenced by social psychology, came out of these scientists in, the 60s saying, why don't people just get that everything's okay? And a lot of the responsibility for misconceptions relies on the lack of understanding on behalf of science communicators. So historically, a lot of the opposition to nuclear power has been due to perceived risk. But, let's be honest, all energy sources have risks and all of them have negative externalities. And so, it begs attention as to why nuclear has gotten, an outsized amount of attention as to the risk factor. And, as I've dug more into the history. Oh, yeah.
Can I ask you a question there?
Yeah, sure.
Because obviously one big thing for California and for the country is the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. And it seems like when you talk about young people, I was at the American Nuclear Society conference in Anaheim recently, and there were a number of young people who said, well, I had concerns until, as you were just talking about, I learned more about it. What are environmentalists saying now about it, given this huge push that we got related to the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant?
That's a really good question. And when I was looking at the polling data, what I found was when people felt, whether they understood it better or not, when people assessed themselves as understanding how nuclear worked, they tended to be more supportive. So that understanding ended up leading to more support. Another thing that I found interesting in looking into the polling data was that the people living closest to nuclear power plants tended to be the most supportive of them. It was about a 90%, I can't remember the buffer, but a 90% support when you live in that proximity. So I don't think I'm necessarily answering your question right now, but there's a lot of factors that go, and they include the media, they include lots of other social psychological variables, but there's a lot of things that go into risk perception. And I do think that Diablo Canyon brought up an opportunity for more learning and hopefully more understanding. And again, education is not indoctrination, but the more you can learn about a technology, the more it can better inform, your concerns.
Well, that's actually very, very helpful. And I think a good segue into bringing in Najm, who has really sort of looked at some of these risks issues. Because you recently penned a letter to the editor about the reliability of nuclear power plants that appear in the New York Times. And can you share with us your concerns around the safety of nuclear power plants, and what improvements you think are needed?
Yep.
Oh, I think we need to, your mute is on there, Najm.
Thanks, Ivan, and hello, Jennifer, and welcome to the audience. That has been a very interesting question that I started my research area and my work because of 3 Mile Island. March 28, 1979 was a milestone and a turning point in my life that changed the direction of my research. I was a doctoral student in engineering, industrial engineering here at USC, wanted to work in a totally different area, but then 3 Mile Island happened and the rest is history. And I have been studying TMI, Chernobyl in 1986, and of course, Fukushima in 2011. One of the biggest issues with nuclear power is it's a safety critical system. By safety critical system, meaning that if something goes wrong, it's going to cause harm for the workers, and then there will be a spillover effect of the consequences, and it may affect the environment and the people around that. And in the case of Chernobyl that we saw, they said that because of the traveling fallout all over Europe, and that they said a nuclear plant accident anywhere is a nuclear accident everywhere. One of the biggest risks to nuclear power plants are the human and organizational factors. And unfortunately, even though it was the root cause of the 3 Mile Island accident, it was a root cause of the Chernobyl accident, and it was cited as one of the biggest issues in the Fukushima accident. If you like, I can elaborate on that, even though it was the earthquake and tsunami, but then Fukushima was preventable. But the point that I try to make in my New York Times piece in letter to editor is I said that we are dealing with a double exigencies. By double energy exigency, I meant that on one side, we have the climate change and the need for decarbonization. The other side is the issue of energy security, that we need more electricity, and because of the invasion of Ukraine and the problem that we see in Germany and in Northern Europe, we are relying more on our domestic sources of energy. Like one of the reasons for example, Germany renewing the license of the 3 reactors that were supposed to be shut down by the end of this year to April 15, 2023 is this reason. And what I said is, since we need this source of energy, or maybe there is a growing need for this source of energy, nuclear power, we need to learn lessons from the past and pay more attention to safety culture. That applies to, of course, Diablo Canyon.
Well, and you mentioned some of the issues with Fukushima. It seemed after the disaster there, we went back to people raising a great deal of concern about continuing with nuclear power. What do you think, Najm, sort of has really driven some of that change? Has it been these, is it climate change? Or is it more, as Jennifer was just talking about, a different kind of understanding, or both?
In my judgment, it has been both. The understanding has improved, and people really have been more, if I may use that term, educated. They know more about the risk of nuclear power. And on the other side, the risk of climate change is really very serious. And there was an estimate by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I saw that it was an amazing number, Ivan. They said in the next 3 decades, the need for electricity will be increased by 85%. 85%. Of course, we need to get this generation of this electricity from somewhere. We cannot have coal plant, we cannot have more gas plant. The hydroelectric capacity is limited, renewal cannot get us the base load. Of course, the nuclear will have a revival. In fact, I've been hearing that left and right, that there will be a revival or another second renaissance for nuclear power pretty soon.
Well, and that really, when I entered the space, particularly covering energy, it was sort of the latter part of what was supposed to be the nuclear renaissance. We were expecting almost 24 new reactors in the country. What we ended up with was one person criticized the South Carolina project, VC Summer, as now an expensive hole in the ground, and the other project that actually will likely make it to the finish line, the Vogtle plant in Georgia, has $20 billion in cost overruns, expected to be as much as $34 billion. So wondering at this point, how do we sort of get there? But before sort of asking Najm about sort of the strategic piece of, well, how do we move from the challenges that we faced in that renaissance that didn't materialize? Jennifer, are there lingering concerns from the environmental community, particularly about nuclear, given what we've got to deal with in terms of climate change? Or has climate change really just becomes so significant that we need to use whatever resources we can muster?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's on the side of the latter. But, with respect to Diablo Canyon, Friends of the Earth was pretty explicit in their opposition. And, if you look at the work of the Union of Concerned Scientists, that was their whole organization was founded. There's a lot of mainstream environmental groups who still either stay silent or oppose nuclear as a viable source of energy. And I think the momentum's changing. And I also think the technology is helping it change. Again, totally out of my wheelhouse. But with these small reactors, a lot of them are factory made. They can be transported by truck. They can be integrated with microgrids that also support renewables. They can be used for emergency responses, and they can also provide for a kind of climate justice and climate equity that a lot of the earlier movement was pretty blind to. A lot of the original opposition to nuclear wasn't so much an opposition to the technology itself, but a skepticism of authority, right? The anti-nuke, movement, the anti-nuclear energy movement came out of the anti-nuclear war movement, which was rooted in the civil rights movement. And, basically the context was that there were a lot of movements where the authority figures were not looking out for the people and the environment. And so a lot of this, if you look at the polling, a lot of people who have more egalitarian values and are worried about hierarchical systems are less supportive of nuclear. And this is sort of a holdover from when the original anti-nuclear sentiments were enmeshed with all these other situations in which authority was being deeply questioned, and rightfully so. So I don't think we're all on the horse. I think there really still is a big stigma out there. And, I guess I would just say, Najm, I feel like, as I've been reading more and more of these nuclear narratives, the idea is like, well, what if everything doesn't work and something terrible happens and it causes huge harm? And yet, let's look at fossil fuels and coal and to some extent natural gas. That's all working great and it's causing huge harm, right? Great from an objective viewpoint. And the argument has been made, from, folks in this conversation that by focusing so much on a very unlikely situation and devoting our energies as people who care about the environment towards nuclear, we're really giving a pass to where 85% of our energy is still coming from, and looking at the risk of nuclear, which again should be paid an absolute ton of attention to, and the slow creep of climate change that is not, is harder to symbolize with the two cooling towers, which ironically are actually supposed to cool the water and make the water that's being output better for the ecosystem. But, the degree to which we fixate on this very marketable threat and not ignore, but pay less attention to the element or the elephant in the room, like, are we using our resources correctly?
What do you think? Because obviously, on the progressive side, you have Governor Gavin Newsom. Well, you have the president, and the Department of Energy have made it very, very clear that nuclear needs to be a part of the equation as we address climate change. How has this seeming shift from the progressive side of things, how have you seen that?
I don't think the shift has fully happened. As much as like Democratic politicians see their base as being environmental, and then, stereotypically anti-nuclear, that's what it's going to be catered to. And Republicans traditionally and still have the opportunity to inhabit that pro-nuclear space. I think, again, it's one of these ideas that everyone cares about the environment, but it's never their top issue. Not never, but traditionally, everyone's an environmentalist, but then you have people rank the most important issues. And until extremely recently, environment has never been in the top 5. So, I think a lot of the reason that, the Diablo Canyon stuff was, it turned out the way it did was because, it's 9% of the state's energy and 18% of the clean energy. Renewables aren't scaling up fast enough. And California residents have so much experience with intermittency, as well as this risk of, rate hikes. And sure, they also think, they like clean energy. So it's about, people will accept a certain level of risk if it's associated with other things that they care more about, and they go to the ballot box prioritizing.
So then, and Najmedin, Jennifer mentioned about small modular reactors, and I wanted to also get back to the question of strategically, how do we see the nuclear energy side of things progressing? Is there a pathway? And are these smart modular reactors that Jennifer just mentioned, how much of that is a real part of the equation from where you're sitting?
I think it's becoming very serious. There are some major companies and big investors like Mr. Bill Gates. He has invested heavily in a major company called TerraPower. There is also another company called NewScale that are moving toward small modular reactors. There have been bilateral agreement among and between many countries like China, South Korea, with Saudi Arabia and others to develop a small modular reactor. But Jennifer mentioned the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a very credible NGO. It has a expert with the name of Dr. Edwin Lyman. Ed Lyman had a piece, which was a monograph, that says small is not necessarily beautiful or better, something like that. Small is not necessarily better. I would urge all of your smart audience that were interested in this topic, take a look at Lyman's very, very beautiful piece of research in this area about the potential problems of the small modular reactors. But the small modular reactors, they are still on the drawing board. Of course, there is a big lobby that pushing for that to make the licensing streamlined and maybe one-point licensing, construction, and then operation. And I think they are going to come up. I mean, I would expect that we may see some of them within the next 10 years and at some very limited scale. And it may proliferate, for a lack of better term, even though proliferation and nuclear is not a good term, but they may proliferate in the rest of the world. But talking strategically, as you mentioned, we have still in United States 92 reactors. I quote your good article, and of course there could be plus, maybe -1 or so. But this, sorry, the light in my office is automatic, it went off. This is another reason that we need to conserve energy and don't be very careful about our sources of energy. But we have this 92 reactors in the United States and something around several 400 of them around the world. But we need to really make sure that we are running that to the maximum level of safety that we can. We need to learn lessons from the past. I remember a quote from George Santayana: those who ignore history, they are forced to relive it. We have to relive the history. If we don't, we ignore the history. Lessons learned of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, I think, has not been fully implemented. For instance, you mentioned the name of our wonderful governor, Gavin Newsom. I really like our governor. He's a tall, handsome, distinguished person. And then he pushed for renewal of or extension of life of Diablo Canyon, which is totally understandable. As Jennifer said, we need uninterrupted, reliable source of power, particularly to deal with the hot summer days and our peaks and that. But Gavin Newsom sent a letter to Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, which is the owner utility of PG&E, in December 2019. In that letter, he said PG&E is known for their past mismanagement, misinformation, and also he uses another term, fail its effort to improve their safety culture. He said that in that letter of December 2019. But then when he pushed for the extension of life of that, there is not that much mentioning of the safety. As I mentioned to you in your piece, it really broke my heart to see the safety was very mentioned in a footnote in passing in the recent state legislation and that on extension of life of Diablo Canyon. This is what bothers me, because where I come from, after coming back from Fukushima, I had to put Tyvek suit and that. I came up with this thing, think about unthinkable. Because Fukushima was unthinkable, but happened. Chernobyl was unthinkable, but happened. When I came back from Chernobyl in 97, I had that. But we really need to think about unthinkable.
Well, so a couple of things. Those 92 or so reactors that we still have, and these proposed small modular reactors, what do you think about the safety profile of first these older ones, and then a technology that we haven't deployed yet in the US in these small modular reactors? How safe do you see them being, and do we have the resources if they need improvements? Do you think we have the resources to bring them to where there's a comfort level with their safety profile?
There is a comfort level with their safety profile, but as you know, the former chairman of Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Greg Jasko, wrote a book after Fukushima. I have it here, called Confession of a Nuclear Regulator. And he, who was the chairperson of US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, he said that we are not doing enough. And this is something that bothers me, because if you really look what happened in Fukushima, as I studied that with my USC student, there was Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Fukushima Daiichi and Daini belong to TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company. The people at the plant who are the first and last layer of defense, they are very dedicated. They are really great people. The same as the employees and operators of the 92 reactors that we have in the United States. They are professionals. I know some of them are my friends. But the problem at Fukushima Daiichi, and the reason that it had a meltdown, whereas Onagawa plant that belonged to another utility, which was on the same coast of the Japan, that received a higher level of the earthquake, and the tsunami height was 1 meter higher at Onagawa, didn't have that. See, this is why I think the utility safety culture at the end of the day determines the safety of these 92 reactors that we have. Not very much necessarily what's going on at the plant and the technology that we are using, which is pressurized water reactor or some boiling water reactors that we have. See, it's not really the engineered component. It's not really, at the end of the day, in my humble judgment, it's not the type of the valve or the pump that we use. It's the safety culture of the utility owner, as it was the case of TEPCO versus Tohoku. And that is something that I'm concerned about Diablo Canyon, not what's going on in San Luis Obispo. It has the most dedicated employee. It's its utility owner, PG&E, that you know that they confessed to involuntary manslaughter for the campfire and destroying the city of Paradise. They were responsible for San Bruno pipeline explosion of 2009. That's why I don't trust PG&E to run Diablo Canyon.
Well, yeah, and having covered from 2017, when the most explosive wildfires began over the last few years, and not just with PG&E, but another utility executive just said to me, well, we did not anticipate that wildfires would get as devastating as they did, and which it becomes a really significant concern that it wasn't anticipated. But I am, and I guess would be remiss, Jennifer, if didn't raise the question about the nuclear waste, and what you're seeing as far as how the environmental community is reacting on that end, and what are the broader concerns there?
Yeah, so nuclear waste is a big concern, and one of the larger reasons that the general public opposes nuclear. I would also say, Najim, I don't disagree at all that regulating the safety of nuclear plants is of utmost importance. What is it? With lots of power becomes responsibility. I don't know. Is it a Star Wars thing? And I also don't want to delegitimize, the catastrophes that were the 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. Like, things went wrong. But based on everything I know, there have not been deaths directly associated with radiation exposure. And so there's a part of me that thinks evacuations cause death and anxiety and lots of, I don't want to, again, don't want to delegitimize the degree to which this affects the biophysical environment, the people that live around it. But when we're looking at death from a particular energy sector, I'm not seeing that direct death in these situations. And I want to be delicate in saying that because they were a big deal. But when you look at waste, this is part of, I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier, nuclear waste, a lot of environmental groups are saying now is if these stringent, absolutely stringent safety standards are put into place, is the best kind of waste you can have, because you can keep it away from the general public. It's not coming out of the tailpipes. It's not going everywhere. It's containable, it's small, and let's regulate the heck out of it and make it so, we're not dealing with, diesel buses and asthma in the inner city. Like, we have an opportunity. Every source of energy is going to have consequences. And if it's going to have consequences of some kind of waste, let's keep it small and tight and figure out the best possible way to deal with it. So, in a lot of ways, the fear of nuclear waste it's problematic. So Yucca Mountain is its own thing. We need somewhere to bury it deep. That's the ideal. Right now it's above ground from what I've heard last. And all of this is problematic. Like, if nuclear is going to be a part of the future, there needs to be a much better discussion of how that waste will be stored, what protocol it needs to be under. But at the end of the day, the type of waste it produces is so much manageable than any of our other alternatives for what's inevitably going to be a growing population and growing economy.
Well, so given what you just said there, would you then sort of surmise that in terms of environmental justice concerns, that nuclear plays a better role for in the environmental justice, on the environmental justice side of things, versus the emissions from the fossil fuel based power plants?
Completely. And similarly, these small reactors, microreactors, again, not my area of expertise, but as they can be deployed to rural areas, there's been a lot of research in, how this can be a way to manage energy access in Africa, where, we talk a lot about conservation in the United States as if that could be some solution. My refrigerator in my house uses as much energy as the average citizen of Malawi does in a year. And it's not fair for us to rob developing countries of the ability to use whatever they need to accelerate economic growth and prosperity and vaccines and dishwashers and all the things that we kind of take for granted. If these things are done safely, if they're done right, if they're done from the ground up. I want to mention my friend Jessica's organization, the Good Energy Collective, but it's a female-run organization that's, working very hard to address the kind of concerns that were big with nuclear, in the 50s and 60s that sort of instigated the anti-nuclear movement, which was, these opaque giant corporations just telling us everything's okay and it not working out that way, and really making it a much more egalitarian, community-driven desire to get access to energy, which everyone around the world does. And, I read the statistic the other day that if we were going to bring everyone in the world up to the US poverty level, right? Our poverty level, that would require a doubling in GDP. And behind that is energy. And so I just feel like the development of nuclear in this different way, with a cognizance to the history and the cognizance with the opaqueness in which it's been deployed on communities, and to do it in a different way, I think, not just within the US, but globally, I really think could be a vehicle for climate justice and a just transition to a clean economy.
Well, and Najm, just also wanted to hear your perspective on the waste side of things as well. And can you give us any perspective about what you see, where we are on the waste issue at this point? As Jennifer was saying, we're using more dry cask storage, as we haven't really resolved the Yucca Mountain issue. But what can you tell us on that end?
I think that's a very serious issue, but being honest with you, like anything nuclear, it has two big components. One of them is the technical issue. The other one is the political issue. I remember when President Obama became president, he put together a blue ribbon commission that Secretary Chu was heading that, and they looked at the Yucca Mountain. But under pressure from Senator Harry Reid, they decided to drop it because he didn't want it over there. And the issue of Yucca Mountain is a sad saga. We need to have a permanent repository place. And the decision for that is more political than technical, in my judgment, because the technical study have been done. But there is also the problem of the nuclear waste issue at the reactor site at the spent fuel pool. You know that when they take the spent fuel from the reactor, they put them in the pool, and they need to cool it for several years for it to get to a lower temperature in order to put that in the dry cask. And the spent fuel pools, in some cases, they are the outside of the containment building. And that could be a big concern for both safety and security. And of course, the thing that happened in Fukushima, because we have the loss of offsite power and a station blackout, the spent fuel pool started to overheat, and we had the problem of the hydrogen explosion because of that. In that case, the spent fuel pool or nuclear waste is also related to how we run our nuclear plants rather than where we are going to store them. And then, of course, there is the issue of transportation. There have been a lot of discussion about putting this dry cask on a train and traveling them through our railroad system may not be necessarily the most politically and publicly acceptable. I heard that about many people. They are objecting and protesting about these mobile Chernobyls, as they call them.
Well, and because one of we've got questions really pouring in, and so one of them was about how safe it is to transport the nuclear materials.
There have been some studies by Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and in fact, National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, about the safety of the transport and the vulnerability of dry casks to different impacts on that. They are pretty sturdy, they are pretty resilient. But then there is a question of our railroad system. And our railroad system and grade crossing accident, and that is happening. We are, in fact, looking at some data from Federal Railroad Administration, FRA, about grade crossing accident. We really need, Ivan, to look at this issue of nuclear waste as a total system, from the spent fuel pool, putting that in dry cask, transporting dry cask, and also putting that to wherever it is Yucca Mountain or not. That's why I always tell my students we have to be very concerned about the tyranny of a small decision. By only looking at one thing, make a small decision over there, thinking that we are doing a good job and saving, so make that safe or secure, but then we may forget the rest of that. This tyranny of a small decision can badly hit us in the case of the both nuclear power operation and nuclear waste disposal.
Well, and just before jumping to some of the related issues, still on the waste issue, there was this question, especially the way you just described those steps from the pool to the dry cask and transportation. Is it better to have one very large disposal site, dozens of medium-sized disposal sites, or hundreds of small disposal sites? Which option is better to protect from a natural disaster?
I think in the United States, Yucca Mountain has been studied to death. I mean, there have been a lot of research about the geological formation of Yucca Mountain, the safety of that, and everything about Yucca Mountain. It has been one of the most expensive piece of research that federal government put a lot of money in researching that and in also running that. I think, and then there were some studies, I remember I've seen that in the past, about that exact question that you asked. I think we have already, Yaka, it's over there. We have spent over several billions of dollars on that. And why not do really do some soul searching and make a decision about that? Because as you know well, that these spent fuel pools are basically reaching to the rim at the nuclear reactor sites, and also having dry cask over there outside, that's also a risk, because then we have the both seismic and terrorism risk for the dry cask. Which, by the way, there is one problem about Zaporozhye nuclear plant in Ukraine is both the spent fuel pool, and more than that is the dry cask, because they could be subject to shelling.
Well, and Jennifer, this is a question from Robert. He's asking, is the resistance to advanced SMRs or small modular reactors the same as the resistance to the large legacy reactors? And are the measurable risks, I guess maybe Najm, better to mitigate with small modular reactors? But first of all, the resistance question. Do you have a sense, Jennifer, of how the SMRs compare to the legacy views?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, hinges on kind of what I was talking about before, which is kind of like sort of a general low level anxiety and resistance, and what is it? Unknowable, unformed, and uninformed was how the study I read, which is how most people tend to feel. Unformed about their opinion and uninformed about what's actually happening. And so given we're not going to have time to talk about like the huge legacy, and when you study nuclear, at least in the US, you're studying media portrayals of nuclear, and the degree to which it really does make such a good marketable story is really important, and the degree to which suspicion has been marketed since the 1950s, and I don't fault that. I mean, China Syndrome is a great movie, but the fact that it was released simultaneously with 3 Mile Island, which some could argue was a success story, and yet the news media was interspersing footage from the movie and the actual accident site together, it has created this culture of fear. And I feel, risk perception is its own field of study. I wonder about, sometimes when I read a lot of the nuclear fear stuff, the very anti, it seems like what if. And, I really like this conversation because I don't feel like that's what we're doing. But what if we stay on the course where a vote against nuclear is a vote for more fossil fuels and coal? Like, I live here in Colorado and I watch these coal trains every single day go down the highway. And that risk seems a lot less flashy and a lot more of what I worry about when I think about the world my kids are going to grow up in.
Well, let me toss this one to you, Najm, because related to what Jennifer just said, this question was put in the chat, and this is kind of up your alley. In Chernobyl, the questioner says, I understand some human error was involved. In California, we would be foolish not to consider the possibility of an earthquake when designing reactors. It seems there are many safety factors that we can consider. The real question is that of risk analysis and considering benefits versus worst case scenarios. Are modern reactors capable of avoiding these kind of worst case scenarios that would make them more preferable to what Jennifer sort of laid out there about the concerns from the fossil fuel polluters?
Of course, some of these modern reactors, they are still on the drawing board. In fact, the question is very perceptive question about learning lessons from Chernobyl and applying that to modern reactors. There is a new committee of National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, that looking, in fact, at this very issue, understanding the societal challenges for these new reactors and new nuclear technology. They held a workshop, and the proceeding of that was recently published a few months ago. They try to address that, but the problem with these new reactors is really we don't know what they are. They say that in quote inherently safe unquote, and there is a big lobby by Nuclear Energy Institute and other organizations about promoting that. But being honest with you, I can't make any judgment on that because I really haven't seen the whole thing. I haven't seen a good risk analysis of that. And also, I have not seen the assumptions that go to PRA, to their PRA, probabilistic risk assessment, because probabilistic risk assessment or probabilistic safety assessment is a very elegant mathematical technique, but the result is as good as the assumptions that you make. And this is really one of the biggest challenges, that it's very hard to quantify human reliability and organizational factors and safety culture and plug those numbers into PRA. I used to teach PRA. And this is one of the challenges that we have for these new reactors and making sound judgment about their safety.
Well, we have Haley here who has weighed in to ask me a question. So, she asks, during your time working as an energy correspondent for a major news publication, how do you feel the reporting on nuclear energy has affected policymaking and public opinion? Jennifer mentioned how risk perception is controlled by the media. Do you think news sources such as the New York Times could be imperative towards educating the public on risk management, energy security? You know, the challenge that journalists face is that, you know, part of our job is to look critically at things, which isn't always appreciated from any quarter, whether it's writing about nuclear or fossil fuels. But part of the picture is to give an honest assessment of what is going on, and what the real needs are and what the real challenges are, regardless of what the generation source is. I mean, there are particularly for an institution like the New York Times, and to look at it in a way, you know, obviously there has been a position sort of taken that we've got to address climate change. So now the question is, how do we do that, given we're trying to electrify everything? And that just means, you know, we've got to look critically at each and every piece. Even, you know, is it most practical to do wind farms in Wyoming and send power to Los Angeles, or large scale solar farms, or more rooftop generation, or how do we balance all of these pieces? Or small modular reactors? What is the combination that helps us to get to where we need to be to address these issues?
If I may add one more thing
Sure.
to Hailey's question about New York Times, I've been a subscriber to New York Times for almost 40 years. And as my student can attest, I often bring their New York Times articles as a class reading material handout. I think I would like to say that as a professor, I put my professor hat. Ivan Penn's article on energy, being Diablo Canyon, he had a very good article last July about California fires, about San Diego gas and electric, are really seminal. I strongly recommend you guys, USC students, you can have a free access to New York Times. You read it. Before Ivan, there was a New York Times reporter with the name of Matthew Wald, Matthew was one of the most perceptive Matt Wald writers about nuclear safety and aviation safety. And Matt Wald's articles were, and still are, some of my handouts. In fact, Matt Wald has an article looking at the FAA and NRC, their similarity and differences. The New York Times can play a very big role, and it has played a very big role in educating me and my students. Thanks, Ivan.
Well, thank you. Jennifer, I'm going to toss this one to you. Aaron asks, assuming environmentalists would generally be in favor of recycling of resources, how do they view the reprocessing of nuclear waste? Is reprocessing an important factor in the future of nuclear energy or less of a concern for now?
That's a good question. I like that. And I'll have Najim answer the second half. I excused myself from the technical stuff from the beginning. But I will say, you know, just in general, first of all, I want to say there's a huge literature on this idea that we should go out there and try to create a certain set of environmental values in people, right? Like people are allowed to think and act in the way that they feel is correct with respect to the natural environment. And there's a lot of paternalism in being like, well, how do we make people care about this? And so that's just something to be aware of. But, you know, I would also say that if you do have a particular political agenda, packaging whatever your issue is, that in a way that's consistent with what your target audience already believes is always going to be more successful. A project I worked on a long time ago with what's now the Breakthrough Institute was we were talking to people about climate skepticism. And we were talking to a lot of, we had a focus group. They were working class, white, mostly men. And, you know, a lot of it was just like, you know, a lot of skepticism. And when we framed the issue as being about risk management, which we've talked about a lot today, the idea was, well, you know, if the weather person says there's a 60% chance of rain, would you bring your umbrella with you? And they were all kind of like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And so when we applied that same kind of messaging to climate, saying, well, okay, maybe these two scientists over here don't agree, but these other 98 do, are you going to bring your umbrella? And we found that the framing, we were working for a DC-based nonprofit at the time, but we found that kind of framing was a lot more effective to the swing vote that they were looking for than if we were just going to kind of say, all right, you all should care about what we care about right now. So I don't know specifically, but to the degree to which you can package a certain objective along with, and in a legitimate way, you know, in the way in which that, you know, that base actually cares about, it's going to be more effective in the long run.
Well, and then we're going to have to give you the last word there, Jennifer, as we have run out of time. But thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Najm. And we'd like to thank the audience for tuning into this discussion. We hope that it was fruitful for you. Thank you all very much.